Change your mind, change your money, change your life. I am Coach Rob Lee Simmons, the host of this podcast, and let me be your tour guide to greatness. I was doing any better, I would be you. Welcome to the Greatness Academy podcast. I am here with one of my good friends, Ryan McGuffee. He is a senior software engineer for General Electric. Welcome to the show, my guy.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for having me, and excited to add to the legacy the show's building already.
So I'm going to tell the public the thing we had a conversation about. Literally one of the smartest people I know, and we have financial conversations all the time. But your approach to finance, and having that economics degree, but your approach to finance is what allows me to think outside the box, and I really appreciate you for that, brother.
Well, yeah, glad to have some positive feedback, and hope you're relaying that back out to all the folks you work with, both on the show and in private. So, however I can help, it's been great to see you grow in a short time, and excited for when you hang the uniform up and you can sort of go head down and all in here.
I appreciate it, man. So let's get into the business. Everybody knows we like to get into the business. So the first question I really want to ask you is, what does your journey look like, from when you were little, and do you ever felt like you would be in this position, and what types of roles did you go down to get to where you are now?
Yeah, so I've had a pretty unconventional journey. I think most folks you meet in the military at some point had a bit of a strange journey in one way or another. And so, my journey was pretty conventional the first 10 years or so, right? I was born on a military base. My dad was in the military for, the first 5 or 6 years of my life. He got out. We moved around a little bit, as you do for, big civilian transitions. And life was pretty normal. And then, my parents got divorced, which wasn't as impactful just on its own, right? Like everybody sort of talks about that and that being challenging. But, my mom got in some legal trouble, and it was, finance related at that time. And so for me, everything about my normal, small town Boy Scout life sort of got turned upside down because your mom is well known in the community as sort of a bad person now, right? And so by association, you sort of have some of that. And so very quickly, I went from this traditional middle class life to living in sort of subsidized communities and just feeling fairly hopeless, through a lot of my teenage years. Quite honestly, I'm good now, right? But at the time, I was sort of lost on me that I had potential, right? I had no concept of that in those years. And so came to sort of move past that. I joined the Army. I had some really great success early on, right? So I was distinguished honor grad at AIT for, the finance school. So that was fun. And sort of was my first real life validation of like, wait, if you apply yourself, there's a lot that you can accomplish, right? And I don't know, maybe this sounds silly, right? Because there's this concept in the world that like every successful white dude like was born into it and sort of was that way from day one. But we have a mutual friend, Manuel, right? And so he told me about buying a house at a young age, and he really encouraged me to do the same thing. And so I set my mind to that goal, but I needed a little bit of money just to have, something of a down payment and some repair money and stuff like that, right? Just the transition expenses, break your lease, all those things. So I took this side job while we were in the same unit, actually selling computers. So I'd go around to Walmarts and Best Buys just teaching people how to use a pretty confusing version of Windows that was out at the time. And so I sort of got this opportunity to, not only be successful in the military, but, have an opportunity to sort of talk about something I really cared about, technology, but, communicate that with strangers more generally. So I had that a little bit of confidence, right? Doing a little side gig while I was in the military. And so I got out and I said, I'm going to be a computer scientist. and an economist. I'm going to blend those two things and do all this cool financial engineering. It's going to be great. And then, I had a kid unexpectedly. About 6 months into that plan, I found out, I leave the army. My wife gets pregnant 6 months later, as life happens. But I came back to school after a semester away, and had a really enlightening conversation with one of the deans. And they said, your story is exceptional for a lot of reasons. You've got to take the path of least resistance. What of the things that you love to learn here can you teach yourself? Can you learn easily or cheaply in other venues? And what do you feel like you really have to have this time and focus in your life to be able to sort of commit to? And so I learned most of my coding skills self-taught anyway. I mean, there were certainly some foundational things in the coursework, but for me, I sort of kicked that to the side and said, okay, I'm all finance guy, for some time. I've got this financial experience on my resume already, right, from the finance core. And so I did some cool jobs there. I did some budget analysis after I left the unit we were in together. And it was a really good journey for me. So I tried my hand with some small businesses, and then I said, you know what, I've got to do some corporate stuff. I've got to make some real money, because I realized that all the goals I sort of had for myself and this vision for where my life would be at 40 or 45 was contingent on having the capital, accumulated in some way to be able to go pursue those things. So, went to work at a larger insurance companies, and had, some good successes there. But ultimately, I wanted to be in a tech first, a science first organization, which is sort of what led me to GE today. So it's been a strange journey, probably a little more elaborate than you were looking for, but
Oh no, that's beautiful.
yeah,
Beautiful
bit of a
story,
roller
man.
coaster ride.
I think that does kind of lay the groundwork for the type of person you are, the man you are, and have become today. I think it's amazing, man, and it's really like a true started from the bottom story. It wasn't Cinderella. That was, it was get rich or die trying, and that's what I
Yeah.
love. That's what I love about your story so much, man. So, software engineers are, and anyone doing data analytics and things of that nature are known for solving complex problems. Though, what are some of your approaches to solving complex problems?
Yeah. So I think that the key is figuring out a solution that's going to make it easier in the future to solve complex problems, right? It's easy to solve complexity with complexity. So you look at the military as a great example, and I've been out for some time, but I recall doing these elaborate leave packets, right? And I know your recent experience is something that's sort of worked to destroy some of those, right? And kudos
Sure.
to you and your team for that. But uh, it was a complex problem, right? Soldiers keep getting DUIs when they get pulled over for their brake lights being out. So we've got to give a long safety brief about DUIs, and we've got to check everybody's car, and then we've got to get a Google Maps and a Bing Maps and everything else to sort of quadruple check that they're safe. Uh, but what they needed was sort of a simpler solution like IPSA, right? And I don't know the platform well. I haven't used it, right? It got out some time ago, as I said, but um, that's really the underlying strategy for me, right? Is figure out how to scale your problem solving approach, not how to take a simple problem and make it more complex in the name of convincing yourself you're right about what you were sort of thinking from the onset.
Yeah, for sure. And so, kind of with that being said, I truly believe that that approach is, I mean, it is a learned skill, but you got to have some level of personality to go with it, because one shoe doesn't fit every foot, right? And so I believe that your approach is probably best said as streamlining processes, right? Oh, I'm about to cuss. Making things easier, especially for the end user. So in solving complicated problems, I think in the finance world, money is more easily. How do you translate um, all of the gifts that you have and your ability to problem solve complex problems into your personal life and your more specifically your finances?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. I think I've tried to be really strategic about sort of key milestones, if you will, right? So there are certain things that I care a lot about in terms of hard and fast rules that I don't want to violate, right? So my wife and I have lived in the neighborhood that we live in for about 5 years. We were renters the first 18 months or so. Not in our house, but about a quarter mile from where we live today. And we wanted to stay in the neighborhood, but we were so far removed cost wise from being able to afford that. I mean, townhouses were more realistically in the budget we were looking at. And so, we sort of found our way into that strategically. But again, I was willing to live an hour away because I knew my career was trending in a work from anywhere, type of capacity, working in technology, whereas my wife, she works in telecom. And so there's much more of sort of a physical infrastructure component where, she's got to be close to the bigger cities or the highway or, a lot of these factors that don't really matter. As long as I can get good internet, I can largely do my job today from, wherever I'd like. So, um, for me, everyone has wants and needs, right? And like trying to find ways to balance those wants and needs in a way that allows me to sort of enjoy some of the fruits of having a relatively successful transition out of the service and into the civilian world with, you know, not letting that impact what, ultimately my goals are. So I guess a quick, easy example of that is your 401k or your Roth IRA or whatever your sort of retirement account vehicle happens to be, in your life, right? That should be completely automated, right? And that is probably obvious to you and to most of your listeners, but I'm astounded how many times I talk to other people sort of around my age and I say, what is your strategy for building your wealth? And it's like, oh well, I get company match after 2 or 3 years. So I figure after 2 or 3 years, I'll go ahead and start contributing. And it's like, what especially, having sort of that economics background, the reason I wanted to stick with that when I came back to school was like, I wanted to understand historically what crazy inflation looked like. I had an appreciation, but not the math skills to express it at the time, that we lived in an era of cheap money. Every bit of my late adolescence and my first home buying process, and even my second to a lesser extent, came from an era of sort of unprecedentedly cheap money, pumped into the American financial system, both from a combination of, sort of domestic policies and institutional choices, but also from the fact that we've historically been a great capital haven for international investors. And so what you saw was, perfect storm of cheap money from the government and outside investors with an appreciation for the cheap money on the table and the greater returns that were to be offered in our financial system with sort of its rigid structure. And so, just understanding what are the prerequisites or the requirements for you to be able to go and achieve what you want to do. Do you need a license? Do you need a particular skill set? Do you need a certification? Do you need to take a test? Do you need a degree? Like, how are you going to get yourself to the place where you can sort of do the thing that you think you want to do in a way that allows you to still sort of meet your financial needs, right? At the end of the day, we'll all retire at some point, even if it doesn't feel like, we've sort of made it, or we haven't got to a place where we're ready to invest. It's got to start somewhere, right? Even if it's small. So I think just getting systematic, getting routine and reliable about how you're saving, and even automating some of those investments in terms of, you pick an asset class or a relatively safe index fund or mutual fund that you're comfortable with, or whatever your financial advisor tells you is the right choice. But don't think about it every 2 weeks. Don't start from scratch every 2 weeks and make it this big decision.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's kind of what I teach my folks is that first thing I'm gonna say, hey, bottom line up front, I'm not going to blow smoke. This is going to take time, and anything like this isn't anything like microwave. This is like planting a seed. Like when you're watering that seed, you're not checking every 2 days for leaves, right? It's going to take some time, and you just have to be prepared when your harvest comes. But you can't start if you never plant a seed. I think that's a really great point. So you talked a little bit about how you have your focusing on milestones. So how do you align your priorities with the goals that you set, and how do you essentially how do you achieve those, checking off the block of those milestones with your priorities?
Yeah. So I think for me, what my biggest financial goal is has changed over time, right? And I think for a lot of people, that's true. But, you know, early in my civilian career and my transition out of the military, the reality is, as a lower enlisted person in the military, especially in a cheap cost of living area like that around where we were stationed at the time, you didn't make huge money, right? You made a little more than me by virtue of having been there longer. And then obviously you stuck around and got promoted, and you've had all these great successes that have blossomed from that. But, I started from a very reasonable baseline. I told myself, if you don't get out at a level of pay from the military that you can jump right out and get a comparable or better pay rate, you're going to be stuck here until you retire. And stuck's maybe a bad word. I don't have any ill will for folks that want to retire, but ultimately my goal was to come in, get college paid for, something I didn't have the funding for coming in, and go to the best school I could get into and see what doors that would open for me, and just continue to sort of aim as high as possible 5 years out and work really, really hard every day, just keeping your eyes open, looking for opportunities to, sort of make that a reality for you. So for me, the last 5 years or so, the big thing was, how do I increase my income? How do I increase it quickly? Right. Because if I want to, and just to be clear, sort of what my goal is, sort of for my roughly 40th, birthday region, is to get into real estate development, and not, commercial real estate development. I think we have enough subways, but there's a big housing demand in a lot of the places that I've ever lived, right? And so a lot of our housing stock in the States is aging. A lot of the folks that can do that work are retiring, and they're not necessarily getting backfilled at the same rates. And so, I try to align my hobbies with things that will make me money, right? It's like I'm on PTO this week, but what I'm doing on PTO is installing hardwood floors in my house, right? And so I could have gone and just relaxed at the beach, right? I only live a few minutes from the beach, but I didn't do that, right? I wanted to keep sort of building that skill. And, my closest friend in the area is a professional plumber. There's a lot of tradesfolk in sort of my family and extended friend group. And so, for me right now, it's about building the capital and building the network that's going to enable me to really knock down dominoes quickly, when I get to a point where I can sort of get more distant from corporate roles and really sort of focus on, being my own boss, I guess, as they say on TikTok.
No, that's good, man. And I think uh, education really plays a massive part in understanding your finances. So, from your perspective, how did your education, specifically in economics, and then other things that you learn through experience in life and life happening to you, how important was your education to your outlook on finances now?
So, I mentioned that my mom got in some legal trouble and it was finance oriented, right? And so specifically it was bad checks, which were a common thing back at the time when, people wrote checks often. I don't know if it still happens. I haven't written a check in some number of years, but I came to be really familiar at a young age with what were the things that were suddenly off limits to my mom within the range of financial services on the market, right? And I sort of blamed those things as a kid for like, oh, we live in this bad neighborhood and like our neighbors are junkies because, and it wasn't entirely that, but there was certainly a component of that, right? When people are locked out of any component of the financial system, it's very difficult to sort of enjoy the freedom to wealth build, right? I talked about the US being a safe haven for capital a few minutes ago. And that happens because of established systems and freedoms and rights that are sort of enshrined in law here. And so when you lose access to some of that, it becomes very difficult to manage your day-to-day finances. And so, you know, I picked the finance core because I had sort of a pre-existing acumen for the civilian financial world. I wanted to understand more about sort of the government side of things. And at Wesleyan, I actually taught some financial literacy seminars, for other students, right? It was important to me that I had really great mentors, folks like yourself. I mentioned Emmanuel earlier as well, right? I had a lot of folks just growing up that took really good care of me, sort of took me under their wing, put me on the right path to success. And so it was important to me that, even on a campus where my perception was these are all rich kids, they don't need any help with any of this. It was like all the first generation college students show out just to like come and understand like how do I manage this when it's not just my student card I'm swiping at the grocery store on campus or whatever, right. Type of deal. So um ultimately I don't think everyone needs to have a super high level of financial knowledge, right? I think it's easier than ever to be an active participant in investing without being as interested in learning how to use a Bloomberg terminal or, learning about derivatives or credit debt swaps or any of these types of things. Like you can automate so much of that. Index funds outperform most of this garbage anyway. So, you know, I like it, and it's a hobby of mine. It's something that I've just always been really interested in, and then I sort of pursued in school and working in insurance. Most people don't realize it's got nothing to do with car crashes or health claims or anything like that. It's a vehicle that tries to invest the capital as efficiently as possible before you make a claim. And so they're expecting you to make a claim. They know you're going to make a claim, or some percentage of you will make a claim, but they have to maintain that capital well. And so, I have an appreciation for how deep and complex it can be, but I think learning enough to keep yourself from trouble is really all you have to do. I don't think you have to be an expert. You just have to know how to recognize when something is complete, sort of BS, for lack of a more friendly term. So yeah, it's easy to sort of see my background and say, oh, well, yeah, it's easy for that guy to say it's simple, right? Like, of course, he's sort of dedicated his adult life to this principle. And it's like, yeah, but a lot of this was sort of intuitive stuff that I realized as a teenager, and I've just been applying pretty successfully so far, right? And right. I have to have the discipline to sort of keep applying those things. But again, I don't have to learn more every day, right? Like I choose to, and that to me was the key vehicle of growing my income, was learn something new every day, whether it was a practical skill, fixing something at my house, or learning a new paradigm in technology, getting a new cloud certification, whatever it is, finding a way to get a little bit better. You don't have to go and spend 6 hours reading Market Watch.
No, that's man, you do a really good job of like leading me into my questions, and I really appreciate this because it's like one of the best interviews. I'm like, oh well, let's talk about it. So let's talk about your mentors. Like, what did your mentors mean to you? Who are some of your mentors today? And then how important do you think it is if somebody's listening today for them to go out and get a mentor?
Oh man. So yeah, I've had a number of mentors. One of them, my oldest son is named after, actually. So, I sort of had mentors before the Army, but then I got to the Army, and I was lucky that, folks would sort of take me under their wing in a lot of senses. Once I was successful in AIT, or our job training for maybe your non-military listeners, uh, someone would come and say, hey, like, we know you're smart and capable, so don't be in here sort of blowing smoke about like you can't figure this out. We know you can figure this out, and we know you're not necessarily applying yourself. And so, my early chief of mill pay in the finance office, that's sort of your senior enlisted person that's signing off on maybe some of the more questionable transactions. He I used to try to get away with shaving every other day because I had a real baby face, right? Even when we met, I still had quite the baby face. And so he would catch me doing it, and he would just make me go, smoke myself in a field of wildflowers next to the office, or like just really silly stuff that, sort of taught me like, okay, you've got to take this stuff seriously enough, right? Like, you can't just coast by on being intelligent or having you did this one thing a few years ago and everything was good. Like, you have to sort of continue to apply yourself. And so largely I had a lot of sort of NCOs that took me under their wing. And then I think when I got to FIMSU, sort of a weird trio of yourself, this Emmanuel character that keeps coming up, and one of our mechanics as well. So you guys were all really great mentors to me for slightly different reasons. And again, we had some really good NCOs in our little rear detachment cohort there. But when I got out, I really struggled. I didn't have a good mentor for a little while, right? Like, I went to a program that was designed to sort of give me this cohort of other veterans that were transitioning into the same school as me. We were going to be doing a lot of the same stuff. Some of our classes were together. Like, you had someone to go grab lunch with, et cetera, et cetera. But I really struggled to connect on campus with a lot of the professors. And, when I came back, my advisor got really honest with me. And she said, I'm going to share some stuff with you that I don't share with a lot of students. And in short, she had a son with some intellectual disabilities and some behavioral challenges that were associated with that. And she knew exactly what it was like to be in a very difficult parenting situation. And she was like, look, I didn't have a kid. I was 21 when I was doing what you were doing, but like, you're only 23. Like, I get it. Just be honest with your professors. Like, they're real people. And so I'm losing some of my train of thought here, right? Because we're having such a good discussion. But ultimately, when I went into the civilian world, I looked for mentors whose ideas were aligned with mine. And I think as important as it is to have a mentor, it's important to understand when a mentoring relationship is not working, or, who is and isn't a good candidate to be your mentor. And so, I came into this development program at an insurance company, right? And they treated us really well. We were sort of the future leaders, blah, 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 right? A lot of companies have programs like this. But there was one particular alumni, and I was like, oh no, that guy's actually a nerd. Like, there's a bunch of people in this room that are faking it, but like, that guy writes code. And so I sort of pulled him to the side and said, like, hey, can I get some time on your calendar just to better understand what's going on? But simultaneously, because I'm in this program, I've got a formal mentor who's a senior vice president at the company, who talks to the CEO every morning, is on the daily stand-up with the CEO and the COO and all the big sort of shots, right? And right. So that mentor only ever challenged me in a way that wasn't really productive to my growth. Whereas this informal mentor taught me where to challenge the systems for growth, right? So like, one of the things was nobody was allowed to have Python at the company, right? And it's like, well, I'm getting Python, right? Like, you can say we can't have Python, but like, I can install this without admin rights on my computer if I really have to. It'd be cooler if I could just be straight up with the help desk and like, you guys just type in your password and we do this the right way. But like, I'm getting it on here, right?
Right,
So,
right,
uh,
right.
and he sort of taught me like, oh, this is the guy you need to reach out to, or that's the guy you need to reach out to. And he sort of taught me how to build up rapport with, sort of the right chain of people that could help me make things happen in IT. And so before long, it's like, oh, not only did you get Python on your computer, but like you just stood up a Linux server. And like, oh, now you're writing automations that like have key business outcomes on this Linux server that like literally only you and this one other guy who graduated the program, like in the entire 10 or 15 year history of this program, even have the skill set to pull something like this
Yeah,
off.
that's amazing.
And so, for me, it was like this great eye opening moment that even when someone is more of an informal mentor and you just have that like natural connection to someone, they can still be giving you tremendously valuable advice, and not to discount uh, or overemphasize sort of these formalized mentoring relationships. But ultimately, I think everyone does need a mentor too. You need a circle of people that know what your goals are, know what your interests are, but also can call you out when you're not applying yourself all the way, or when there's a better way to sort of get where you think you want to be headed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like every time you throw me this alley oop, I'm gonna slam dunk it, right? So, I mean, you really answered the question that I had was how important is having a network. But let's go a little bit deeper into that question and say, what does your network look like, or what do you think it's supposed to look like?
Yeah. So, um, my network is really interesting today, right? So I'm still in close contact with that mentor that was, informal. That person leads a digital marketing team today at a relatively large company, but for his privacy, I won't jump into which company that is. Um, and we continue to sort of talk shop, and we're friends more generally at this point. But um, for me, I think what gets really tricky um, is just understanding how people aren't always what they look like, right? So my closest friend here is a plumber, right? And that's a crazy thing, but the reality is it's the only person in Maine I've worked with at two different companies, and we did amazing stuff together. We designed a logo that got put on 15 different retail stores. So 15 retail stores got built out with the branding suite we designed in-house in a room with concrete floors,
That's
right? Like
amazing.
this wasn't a high tech shop. It was a couple of smart guys with Max and Photoshop and Illustrator, right? Like,
Right.
so finding ways to, sort of be able to have some kind of an impact uh, with your network is really key. And so, you might have someone that you weren't planning to keep in your network. This person, when I first met them, they had a very different background than me. They came from family money. I didn't really think I was going to get along with them. I was like, oh, this mf'er, right? Like, uh, we're just not going to get along. And I had sort of this disdain for people from a wealthy background, and I've worked through that now as I've sort of gotten to make a little bit more money myself. But um, we recognized, hey, we work really well together. So the second time we worked together, he was the COO at a company, and he called and said, hey, I know you're feeling a little burned out at this insurance company. Like, you want to come help me out? There's some stuff I think you can make a lot of an impact in 6 or 9 months, and then when you're ready to make sort of that splash over to a larger company, you find the right opportunity. Like, let's talk through it, and you'll transition. And so that's sort of what I did between insurance and GE. But again, we did the same thing. We down to buying the same label printer, right? We bought the same label printer. We printed out hundreds of test things and the colors and how they differ on the paper from in your design suite digitally. And uh, you know went from a company that had no branding whatsoever, at least no consistent branding. They had a logo, but that was about it, to a company with a very distinctive set of package designs and many of their core products followed a very cohesive brand language. And so, that's a person where he saw plumbing as a more consistent line of work than brand design. But at the end of the day, this is the person I talk small business ideas with endlessly, right? Because we've had such success in the past. And so being able to recognize, like, hey, not only was I wrong about my like first impression or my first assumptions about something or someone, but having sort of the courage and the humility to say, hey, we did really great stuff together and we should do that again. And that's how a lot of the great startups we know were built, right? And I'm not saying that myself and that person are going to go do that, but everyone has those people in their lives. Everyone has somebody that you've worked with in the past and is like, this person brings out the best in my skill set. This person can articulate the needs in a way that's so translatable to me. And we set each other up for success and just complement each other really nicely. And so that to me is a key factor in all of my network. Honestly, if we don't have a cohesive and sort of natural flow, it's going to be difficult for me to sort of artificially pretend to maintain that relationship. And sort of, I can do it. I work in corporate America, right? I'm not incapable, but I'd prefer not to, right? I don't
Yeah,
spend
I
a lot of
got you.
free
Yeah, it'd be
time
much,
on it.
much easier if you just didn't have to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I get you. So let me ask you this, man. I asked all of my guests this question, and I just love to hear the answers. So, what is the largest purchase you ever made, and then how did it make you feel?
Yeah, so the largest purchase I ever made is actually my current house. And so I touched on it a little bit, but trying to find something sort of in my budget that uh had to have a garage, right? I'm a little bit of a car guy, so that's the one place where I'm a little freer with my budget than my better discipline would or judgment would tell me I should be. But ultimately, I don't have any cars that I bought new, right? I have 4 cars in my driveway, but they were all bought used, and two of them combined were $5,000, right? So, uh, for me, this house was really important because my wife was pregnant, and I made this crazy sort of half court shot back in 2018. So, we moved up to Maine. My wife got this job in telecom at this big growing fiber optic company, and life was great. But the problem was it's impossible to find somewhere to live in Maine in the summer, especially on the coast, right? Everyone comes here in the summer. Everyone, books everything up for 3 months at triple the normal rent. And then there's nowhere for like a reasonable family to live. So I found this place that just came on the market, had just finished construction, this townhouse. We were the first people to live in it. And the landlord was like, hey, I know you responded to this 12-month lease offer, but how about a 36-month lease? And like, dude, that is the craziest thing I've ever heard. Uh, First off, you got a bunch of raises baked into this thing, and I'm just not doing that. But second, I'm hearing rumors about the tax policy and where that's headed. And this was shortly before the Trump tax cuts actually were passed.
Mhm.
And I said, I think there's going to be an economic catastrophe in early to mid 2020. So I won't sign a lease longer than 18 months. And that lease expired at the end of March 2020. And I bought this house in January 2020.
Oh, wow.
And so not only did I avoid the calamity of buying real estate in the last, 3 years, because we're sort of past the 3 year point now,
Right.
but I locked in an extremely reasonable rate. I had a secure job. I had been there for a long time. I used, the great benefit that is the VA loan, but it's a house where I've always applied myself, and I did this at my other house too, but I work really hard to drive up the value of this place, right? The first summer I rebuilt about a third of the deck. A lot of it was just in rough shape. It needed a lot of work. And it's about 1,000 square feet. So it's a sizable deck,
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
a big
got all
size.
these curves and built-in benches, and there's just a lot to sand and paint and all those things. But I remodeled a bathroom, right? I'm installing hardwood floors across the whole first floor of the house, right? So for me, people talk about like what's an appreciating asset, what's a depreciating asset, and ultimately, a house is a depreciating asset. That's hard for people to wrap their mind around. The land it sits on appreciates wildly, but the building depreciates.
For sure.
And the biggest expense you face in mitigating that depreciation, and I think what will become a larger share of the expense, is not having sort of the skills or the network to be able to overcome an immediate need quickly, right? It's like, it's weird that I'm this, tech sort of leader guy, right, or low level leader, but my best friend is a plumber. But also, if your toilet breaks, who would you rather your best friend be, right? Like,
exactly.
And so, he was someone I could lean on as I was sort of building out the bathroom, but, we've replaced the driveway. And so between a combination of strategic investments on our part and things where we can make our dollar go really far by sort of bending that depreciation curve with some of our own sort of natural or created competitive advantages, right, through either our network or our skill sets, we're in a great position. The house is worth, more than double what we paid for it. And we're, the original goal was we're going to cash out when it hits, 500. We got in it somewhere around 280, right? And so, like, that's a great return. It's going to take us, let's call it 8 years was the goal. We're going to be in here for 8 years. That's how long it's going to take for the value to reach 500. And, we'll probably be at 600 mid next year. And so,
wow.
Right. So we're so far off of the original goal. And the whole idea is leverage the capital in this place to be able to, start to invest in other places, whether that is small businesses or, very curated multi-tenant properties. But I think ultimately this strategy that people have of, I'm going to buy a house, I'm going to fix it up for cheap, because labor is cheap. It always will be cheap. And trade skills are cheap. I think that's flawed in a lot of ways, right? So it's a lot easier to find an electrician than a carpenter today, because nobody wants to do your baseboards when they can get paid twice as much to play with your electrical panel, right? Like, and you only need 3 more months of school. Okay. Great. So yeah, for me, it's been a great venue to sort of capitalize on a lot of the projects and types of skills I wanted to learn in that first house. But as we discussed, on an E4 salary, there was a much lower ceiling on what the possibilities were, right? I couldn't, at that point in my life, I couldn't have gone to a flooring distributor and put, 2 pallets of flooring in the back of my truck and driven them home, and then had the tools to go figure out how that all goes down, correctly, having done some of this before. So, yeah, the house, and I think that sounds a little silly compared to some of the folks you've had on the show, certainly, but at the same time, I think for the average American, that's where most of your capital is tied up. And so, for me, I see it as a potential vehicle to leverage debt for growth later. But that's a very curated strategy, and it's highly dependent on the future of rates, right? If we're looking at a prolonged, 10 to 12% rate on HELOCs, I've got no interest in, leveraging that capital in that way. There's other ways, Airbnb, resale, 1031. There's lots of options for capitalizing on that without, trying to make a return with a 12%, floor on what you earn.
No, that's good. Hey, brother. So I really, really appreciate you for jumping on. Thank you so much for providing your expertise. And again, people can see why I say this is the smartest man I know. And I hope they see it as well, brother. On the show, we say that winners win, and we win, you win. And we want to thank you for being a winner.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's been great to be here, and I continue to watch the show grow, and excited to see some of the other exciting guests you have in store for upcoming episodes. So I'll keep my eyes out. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right, you as well, brother. And we are out. Boom. Thank you for joining the podcast. And remember, change your mind, change your money, change your life. We out.